The knock on my door was unexpected. It had been years since I last saw Nathan, my college roommate and closest friend during some of the most pivotal moments of my life. The years after graduation had drifted us apart. Work, relationships, and the weight of adulthood carried us in different directions. So when I opened the door and saw him standing there, a grin that hadn't changed since the day we met lighting up his face, my heart stuttered. "Liam!" he exclaimed, his voice warm and familiar. "Thought I'd surprise you." I let out a laugh, shaking my head in disbelief as I pulled him into a hug. "Nathan, you idiot! It's been what, 10 years?" "Too long," he replied, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place, regret, maybe. "I was in town for work and thought, why not? Still living in the same place, huh?" "Yeah," I admitted, motioning for him to come inside. Old habits die hard. The apartment suddenly felt smaller with Nathan there. He had a presence that filled a room, always had. He looked the same, but different. His shoulders were broader, his face more lined with experience, but his eyes, they carried the same spark that had once drawn me to him during those late-night study sessions when we were just two guys trying to figure out the world. We sat on the couch, beers in hand, and fell into easy conversation. Stories of old pranks, late-night escapades, and embarrassing moments spilled out between us, each memory met with laughter and the occasional wistful pause. It was as if no time had passed at all. "So," I asked after a while, "what made you look me up after all this time?" Nathan hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Honestly, I've been thinking about a lot lately, about us. You were the one person who always understood me, Liam. I realized I missed that." There was a weight to his words, a vulnerability that left me momentarily speechless. The air between us shifted, heavier now, laden with unspoken thoughts. I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture meant to comfort, but even that small touch felt charged. "Nate," I began, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "Sorry," he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't mean to get all heavy on you." "It's okay," I assured him. "I've missed you too." His smile returned, softer this time, and for a moment the world outside my apartment ceased to exist. The night stretched on as Nathan and I caught up, our conversations swinging between the light-hearted banter of old friends and moments steeped in reflection. He leaned back on the couch, his long legs stretched out in front of him, fingers wrapped around a beer bottle that he absent-mindedly rotated between sips. There was something unguarded about him, a kind of openness I didn't remember from our college days. "You ever think about those nights on the quad?" Nathan asked suddenly, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "The all-nighters, the stupid dares, well, everything?" "All the time," I admitted, smiling. "Those were some of the best moments of my life." He glanced at me, his gaze lingering. "Mine too." The quiet that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried a weight that made me acutely aware of how close we were sitting. I could see every detail of his face in the dim light, the faint stubble on his jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the way his lips quirked slightly as if he wanted to say something but was holding back. "Liam," he began hesitantly, his voice quieter now, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, setting my bottle on the coffee table. "Anything." "Back in college, did you ever feel like there was something more between us? Something we never talked about?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Memories rushed back. Those late-night conversations that veered into the deeply personal, the fleeting touches that lingered just a second too long, the unspoken connection that I'd never dared to examine too closely. I don't know," I stammered, feeling my face flush. I guess I never really thought about it." Nathan laughed softly, shaking his head. "That's a lie, Liam. You thought about it. I know you did because I did too. My chest tightened at his words, and I struggled to find my voice. Nate, I... He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he looked at me. I'm not saying this to mess things up. I've spent years wondering what might have happened if we'd been honest with each other back then. And seeing you now, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The intensity in his gaze was overwhelming, and I had to look away, my thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and something I couldn't quite name. Desire? Longing? Both? Nate, we were kids, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper.
We didn't know what we wanted. Maybe not, he agreed, but we're not kids anymore. His words hung in the air, a challenge and an invitation all at once. My heart was racing and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I wanted to say something, anything, but before I could, Nathan reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, the kind that made it impossible to deny what I'd been feeling all along. I turned to face him, and our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, Nathan leaned in. My breath caught as his face came closer, his intentions clear. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to just the two of us and the electricity crackling in the space between us. When his lips met mine, it was soft at first, tentative, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into the kiss, my hands finding their way to his shoulders. The years of unspoken feelings, of suppressed desires, surged to the surface, and the kiss deepened, becoming something raw and undeniable. Nathan pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. "I'm sorry," he murmured, though his voice held no regret. I had to know." I shook my head, my hands still resting on his shoulders. "Don't apologize. I've wondered too." The tension between us didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew stronger. I could feel his breath against my skin, the warmth of his body so close to mine, and in that moment, I knew there was no going back to the way things were. "I never stopped thinking about you," Nathan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even when we lost touch, you were always there in the back of my mind." His vulnerability disarmed me, and I felt my own walls crumbling. "Me too," I confessed, "but I didn't think you felt the same way." Nathan smiled, a hint of sadness in his expression. "Maybe I was too scared to say it back then, but I'm not scared anymore." His words sent a shiver through me, and before I could overthink it, I closed the distance between us again. This kiss was different, more assured, more deliberate. My hands slid down to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath my palms. He wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me closer, and the world seemed to fade away entirely. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads still pressed together. "What now?" I asked, my voice unsteady. Nathan chuckled softly, his fingers brushing against my cheek. "I guess we figure it out. Together." The weight of the moment still hung in the air as we sat in the dimly lit apartment, so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Nathan's hand remained on mine, grounding me in a reality I was still struggling to process. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and an undeniable pull toward the man who had once been the most important person in my life. "Nate," I began, unsure of where to start, but he squeezed my hand gently, silencing me. "Liam, you don't have to say anything right now," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I've already said too much, haven't I?" I shook my head quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "No, not too much. Just enough. This is a lot, you know? Seeing you again, everything you've said." "And done," he added with a self-deprecating smile, though there was no regret in his tone. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound breaking through the tension and drawing a grin from him. "Yeah, and done. He leaned back slightly, his hand still resting on mine as he studied my face. "I'm not trying to push you into anything, Liam. I meant what I said. This is about honesty. I just didn't want to leave here without at least telling you how I feel." The sincerity in his voice disarmed me, and I felt a lump rising in my throat. How had we gone so many years without acknowledging this? How had I convinced myself that what I'd felt back then was nothing more than a passing thought, an inconvenient crush buried beneath layers of friendship? "Nate," I said quietly, my gaze meeting his, "I don't know where this goes, but I don't want to ignore it anymore." His eyes softened, and for a moment the vulnerability in his expression took my breath away. "Me neither," he admitted, "but if we're doing this, I want to do it right." I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me. There was no roadmap for what lay ahead, no clear path to follow. But as I looked at him, sitting there with his familiar grin and those eyes that held a million unspoken thoughts, I knew that whatever this was, it was worth exploring. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside. Then, with a nervous laugh, Nathan gestured toward the kitchen. "Got anything stronger than beer? I think we could both use it." Relieved by the break in tension, I stood and led him to the kitchen, pulling out a bottle of whiskey that had been gathering dust on the top shelf. As I poured us each a glass, I felt his presence behind me, closer than necessary but not unwelcome. His hand brushed against mine as he took his glass, and the spark that passed between us was as undeniable as it was electrifying. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass with a crooked smile. "To honesty," I countered, clinking my glass against his. The whiskey burned on the way down, but the warmth that spread through me wasn't just from the alcohol. Nathan's gaze lingered on me as we leaned against the counter, and I found myself drawn to him in a way that was both familiar and entirely new. "You know," he said, his tone teasing, "I half expected you to slam the door in my face when I showed up tonight." I laughed, shaking my head. "I thought about it for a second." He feigned a wounded expression, his hand over his heart. "Harsh." "But then I remembered how much I missed having you around," I added, my voice softening. The teasing glint in his eyes faded, replaced by something deeper. "I missed you too, Liam. More than I realized until now." The air between us grew heavy again, but this time it wasn't unsettling. It felt like the natural progression of something that had been waiting years to unfold. Nathan set his glass down and stepped closer, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from my forehead. The gesture was so tender, so intimate, that it made my breath catch. "You've always been important to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even when we weren't talking, you were always there." My chest tightened at his words, and before I could overthink it, I closed the small distance between us. His lips were warm and familiar, the kiss both hesitant and insistent, as if neither of us wanted to let go. My hands found their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer, and the rest of the world seemed to fade away. When we finally broke apart, his forehead rested against mine and I could feel his breath against my skin. "Is this really happening?" I murmured, more to myself than to him. He chuckled softly, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm. "It feels like it's been happening for years, doesn't it?" I nodded, unable to argue. Everything about this moment felt inevitable, as if it had been waiting for us to catch up to it. And though the future was uncertain, the one thing I knew for sure was that I didn't want to let him go again. "We'll take it slow," Nathan said as if reading my thoughts. "Figure it out as we go." "Yeah," I agreed, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Slow sounds good. We stood there for a long time, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the moment, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The rest of the night passed in a haze of soft laughter and stolen glances, as if we were rediscovering each other in a way that defied the years we'd spent apart. By the time the whiskey bottle was half empty and the conversation had drifted into a comfortable lull, Nathan stretched his arms above his head, letting out a contented sigh. "You've got a way of making a guy feel at home," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. "Well, don't get too comfortable," I teased, though the warmth in my tone betrayed my words. "I'm not running a bed and breakfast." Nathan raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching into a smirk. "You could have fooled me. You even poured the good whiskey." "Good whiskey might be pushing it," I countered, leaning back against the couch, "but I figured you deserved something decent for showing up out of the blue." He chuckled softly, his eyes lingering on me in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "And here, I thought I'd have to work harder to get back in your good graces." "You always did have a knack for shortcuts," I shot back, my smile widening. Nathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he regarded me with a look that was both familiar and disarming. "You know, I wasn't sure what to expect when I showed up tonight. I thought maybe you'd slam the door in my face." "You already said that," I reminded him, my tone light but curious. "What's with all the self-doubt?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands as he twisted the glass in his fingers. "Because I screwed up, Liam. Back then, after college. I should have said something, should have stayed in touch. But I didn't. And that's on me." The vulnerability in his voice made my chest ache. I reached out without thinking, placing a hand on his arm. "You didn't screw up, Nate. Life happened. And if we're being honest, I wasn't exactly banging down your door either." He looked up at me, his expression softening. "Still, I could have been better." "We both could have," I admitted. "But we're here now. That's what matters." Nathan's smile returned, faint but genuine, and the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease. "You're too good to me. You know that." "Someone's gotta be," I quipped, though the sincerity in his eyes made my teasing falter. The quiet that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with unspoken words, but in a way that felt natural, like we were both content to let the silence speak for us. My hand lingered on his arm, the warmth of his skin grounding me as the reality of the night settled over us. "You know," Nathan said eventually, his voice breaking the stillness, "I used to imagine this." "Imagine what?" I asked, though my heart already knew the answer. "This," he said, motioning between us, "sitting here with you, talking like no time had passed, and maybe something more." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with memories. Those late-night study sessions where his laughter felt like home, the way his hand would linger on my shoulder just a second too long, the unspoken tension that had always simmered beneath the surface. "Nate," I said softly, my voice trembling, "I don't know if I'm ready for what you're saying, but I know I don't want you to leave." "I'm not going anywhere," he replied, his tone steady and sure. "Not unless you tell me to." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I had spent years convincing myself that the connection between us had been a figment of my imagination, a foolish crush I'd buried beneath layers of denial. But now, with him sitting here, his gaze unwavering, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. "I don't know where this goes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to find out. With you." Nathan's smile widened and he leaned back, his arms draped casually over the back of the couch. "That's all I needed to hear." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, the knot in my chest loosening as relief and something warmer flooded through me. We sat there for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing, our conversation slipping into the easy rhythm we'd always had. It wasn't until the clock struck midnight that Nathan glanced at his watch and let out a low whistle. "Didn't mean to keep you up so late," he said, though there was no regret in his voice. "I don't mind," I replied honestly. "It's been a long time since I've had company like this." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Then I'll take that as a good sign." As the night stretched into the early hours, the atmosphere between us shifted again, becoming quieter, more intimate. Nathan's hand brushed against mine as he reached for his glass, and the spark that passed between us was enough to make my breath hitch. "Stay," I blurted out before I could second-guess myself. "I mean, if you want to, you don't have to leave." Nathan looked at me, his expression unreadable for a moment, before a slow smile spread across his face. "Are you sure?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, I'm sure." He set his glass down and leaned closer, his hand finding mine once more. "Then I'll stay." The words were simple, but the promise behind them was anything but. And as the hours stretched on, I felt the walls I'd built around myself begin to crumble, leaving me open to whatever came next. The stillness of the apartment felt heavier as the night deepened. Nathan and I had moved from the couch to the floor, sitting cross-legged opposite each other, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. The whiskey bottle stood between us, now nearly empty, a silent witness to the hours we had spent unraveling the threads of our past and cautiously weaving something new. Nathan's knee brushed against mine, the contact subtle but deliberate. He was watching me again, the way he always had, intently, as if he could see past every defense I had built over the years. It was unnerving, but it was also comforting in a way I hadn't expected. "You've changed," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but there was a weight to his words that made my chest tighten. "So have you," I replied, offering a faint smile. "It's been a long time." "Yeah," he agreed, his gaze never leaving mine. "But some things feel the same." I felt the air shift between us, charged with an energy that was both familiar and entirely new. My throat tightened and I reached for my glass, taking a sip to steady myself. "Like what?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Nathan hesitated, his expression softening. "Like the way I feel when I'm around you." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard, and I looked down at the glass in my hands, the weight of his words settling over me. "Nate." "You don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. I want you to know. I don't want to hold back anymore." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest.
The vulnerability in his words mirrored the feelings I had spent years trying to suppress. The emotions I had convinced myself were nothing more than nostalgia for a simpler time. "I've been thinking about us too," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "About what might have been if things had been different." Nathan's hand found mine, his touch warm and steady. "It's not too late, Liam. We can still figure this out." I met his gaze, the sincerity in his eyes making my breath catch. "But what if we mess it up? What if this ruins everything?" He shook his head, his grip on my hand tightening slightly. "We've already been through so much. If this is real, and I think it is, it's worth the risk." The weight of his words settled over me, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe this connection we shared was worth fighting for. Nathan shifted closer, his knee pressing against mine as his hand moved to cup my cheek. "Liam," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion, "I've spent years wondering what it would feel like to be this close to you. And now that I'm here, I don't want to waste another second." Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both tender and filled with longing. My hands moved to his shoulders, pulling him closer as I let myself get lost in the moment, the years of distance between us melting away. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads pressed together. "You have no idea how much I've missed you," I murmured, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I was feeling. Nathan smiled, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "I think I do." We stayed like that for a while, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the moment, the world outside my apartment fading into irrelevance. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, Nathan leaned back, his hand still resting on mine. "I don't know what's next," he admitted, his voice soft, "but I know I don't want to lose this." "Me neither," I replied, my heart swelling with a mix of fear and hope. "We'll figure it out. Together." His smile widened, and he leaned in to press a gentle kiss to my forehead. "Together," he echoed, the promise in his voice filling me with a sense of certainty I hadn't felt in years. And as the sun rose, casting a warm glow over the room, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. I was ready to embrace it, with Nathan by my side.